Okay, now we'll move in and talk about Vygotsky's theory of sociocultural development. So there are some basic terms that you should be aware of regarding Vygotsky's theory. First, let's discuss the zone of proximal development. The difference between what children can do with assistance and what they can do alone defines the zone of proximal development. And an idea that follows from Vygotsky's basic premise that cognition first develops in a social setting before children become more independent is this zone of proximal development. So Vygotsky believed that children's learning takes place in this zone. So there's a range of tasks too difficult for the child to do alone, but possible for the child to do with help of adults or more skilled peers. The idea is that teachers should provide learning experiences that are within this zone and that this can help maximize achievement. For learning to be effective, the adult also needs to engage in scaffolding. This is where they're adjusting the support offered during a teaching session to fit the child's current level of performance. So, control of cognitive skills is most readily transferred from others to the child through scaffolding. And this is when that teaching style involves the teacher letting children take on more of a task as they master its different components. So the defining characteristic of scaffolding is basically you're giving help, but you're not giving any more help than is truly needed. So mothers in different cultures accomplish scaffolding in different ways. Students do not learn as well when they're told everything to do, but they also are not going to learn if they're left alone to discover things for themselves. So an example of when you might scaffold would be if you're like playing with blocks with your child and you're trying to build a tower, and it might be very difficult for them to stack these blocks at first. So maybe you give them like a box or something and they can stack the blocks in the box, and that scaffolds it for the child. And then once they're able to do it without the box, then you just take a more hands-off approach. Vygotsky believed that children also speak to themselves for self-guidance. So he thought that language is really helpful because children can think about their mental activities and behavior and select courses of action. So in Vygotsky's view, as children get older and tasks become easier, their self-directed speech is internalized as silent inner speech. So Piaget thought that when children are talking to themselves, that it was really just a sign of their egocentrism. But Vygotsky thought that talking to yourself is actually really helpful in guiding your actions and your behavior. So almost all the studies over the past 3 decades have supported Vygotsky's perspective, and children's self-directed speech is now called private speech. So private speech is one way that children can regulate their behavior, and it represents this intermediate step in the transfer of control of thinking from the others to the self. So children often talk to themselves, particularly when the task is difficult or after they've made a mistake. So speaking of talking to yourself, we're now going to move into discussing language. So let's start with this question. How do children acquire grammar? Well, depending on your worldview and your perspective, you have a different answer for this question. So behaviorists, now remember, behaviorists think that you learn basically only through your environment. So a behaviorist answer is that children imitate the grammatical forms that they hear. They're also reinforced when they speak properly. A linguist would say that children are born with these neural circuits in the brain that allow them to infer the grammar of the language that they hear. So Noam Chomsky is a big language researcher, and he's associated with the linguist perspective, and I'll talk more about him in just a second. The cognitive solution would say that children learn grammar through powerful cognitive skills that help them rapidly detect speech patterns that they hear in their environment. So, according to the social interaction perspective, language learning takes place in the context of interaction between children and adults. So let's talk more about this question. How do children acquire grammar? Well, there was a very big debate in the literature actually between Chomsky and Skinner. So Chomsky was a linguist, and he really criticized the behaviorist model. Skinner's a behaviorist. He criticized the behaviorist model of language acquisition. And basically his critique was, if it's really just only language learning is only based on imitation and reinforcement, then how can we explain why children often make errors like calling a group of mice mouses? Or like Lenny, a lot of times he'll say, I catched the ball, And so the idea here is like, as adults, nobody talks like that. So how are they getting that? How are they making up these new words? So Chomsky basically said that we have a language acquisition device in our brains that we're born with. And this device contains some information about the structure of language that makes language acquisition possible. So he thought that language learning is special because children have innate knowledge of a set of principles about language. And he called this universal grammar. So he thought that it wasn't specific to a particular language, and that's why he called it universal grammar. So again, he thought we were born with this innate knowledge of syntax structure and grammar rules. So according to Chomsky's theory, then, all children have this innate language acquisition device. But researchers have challenged Chomsky's theory, saying, well, it's really difficult to specify this idea of universal grammar. Also, children's progress in mastering many sentence constructions is gradual, indicating that there's more learning and discovery than Chomsky assumed. So many argue that what is actually innate is probably just a more general cognitive learning device, and language is acquired through social engagement with others. So this is, again, that interactionist belief that there's an interaction between our inner capacities and environmental influences.